They were supposed to be the future of Europe. The bright young men, full of energy, hope, and ambition, marched off to war in 1914 with dreams of glory, adventure, and honor. Many believed that the war would be over by Christmas, a brief conflict that would cement their place in history as heroes. But reality was far harsher. They encountered not the romanticized battlefield of parades and duels, but an industrialized slaughterhouse where modern weapons and outdated tactics combined to create unprecedented carnage. The experience left a permanent mark on the continent and created what would be remembered as the lost generation, a cohort of young men whose lives, potential, and innocence were obliterated in the mud and blood of World War I. This generation's loss was not just measured in numbers, it was a cultural and societal void. Across Europe, entire communities felt the absence of sons, brothers, and fathers. Towns and villages lost the young men who would have carried on family businesses, traditions, and legacies. Cities mourned the future engineers, writers, doctors, and leaders who never returned. The scale of this devastation was staggering. Of the more than 70 million men mobilized during the war, almost 10 million were killed in combat, and another 20 million were left wounded, many permanently disabled. The losses were not abstract statistics. They were real lives extinguished, futures erased, and dreams destroyed. Families received telegrams in place of sons, letters that never arrived, and graves that could not be marked. The human cost was immense, and the social impact was catastrophic. The battlefields of the Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, became the defining environment for this tragedy. Trench warfare trapped soldiers in endless cycles of attack and counterattack, with artillery, machine guns, and poison gas, ensuring that each offensive was more lethal than the last. Young men who had trained for conventional combat were sent into slaughterhouses designed for maximum destruction. The mud of Flanders and northern France became synonymous with death, disease, and hopelessness. Soldiers suffered not only from enemy fire, but from exposure, trench foot, and dysentery. The technology of war, combined with outdated tactics, transformed battlefields into death traps, where one advance could decimate an entire regiment within hours. Those who survived often returned physically maimed or psychologically scarred, carrying invisible wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll on this generation was profound. Survivors faced a landscape of death, witnessing friends, comrades, and leaders cut down before their eyes. The sense of purpose, hope, and invincibility that had driven them to enlist was shattered. Many soldiers returned home with what would later be recognized as shell shock, a condition of deep trauma and anxiety resulting from continuous exposure to artillery, gas, and the horrors of trench warfare. These men found it nearly impossible to reintegrate into civilian life. Jobs, families, and social relationships had been disrupted or destroyed. Communities had moved on or were themselves grieving, leaving survivors isolated, alienated, and haunted by memories too terrible to forget. The emotional landscape of the lost generation was a mixture of grief, guilt, and disillusionment, a lasting shadow of the war's brutal efficiency in extinguishing youth. Beyond the immediate human suffering, the lost generation reshaped European culture and thought. Writers, poets, and artists attempted to process the incomprehensible loss through literature, music, and visual art. Figures such as Ernest Hemingway, Wilfred Owen, and Siegfried Sassoon became iconic voices, capturing the horrors of modern warfare and the futility of human sacrifice. Their works conveyed the despair, disillusionment, and moral confusion of a generation that had been taught honor and glory, but had only experienced the raw brutality of industrial combat. The lost generation was not just a demographic tragedy. It was a philosophical and cultural rupture that questioned the very foundations of the societies that had sent these men to die. The demographic consequences were equally severe. European countries faced a skewed population pyramid with significant losses among men of fighting age. This created imbalances in post-war labor markets, slowed population growth, and affected family structures for decades. Marriages were delayed or foregone entirely due to the absence of eligible men. Birth rates declined, leaving behind fewer children to carry on the legacy of a generation that had already been decimated. The loss of young men was not evenly distributed either. Certain regions, especially rural areas where recruitment was high, saw entire villages lose most of their male population, leaving widows and orphans in their place. The war created demographic scars that would influence Europe well into the mid-20th century, altering social, economic, and political trajectories. The lost generation also had a profound impact on military and political thinking. Leaders who survived the war were often deeply affected by the losses and destruction they had witnessed, leading to a pervasive skepticism toward large-scale conflicts. Some sought to avoid war at nearly any cost, influencing interwar diplomacy and shaping foreign policies that ultimately failed to prevent future conflict. The disillusionment with authority and traditional institutions fueled radical movements, social unrest, and political experimentation across Europe. The void left by the lost generation was not merely personal, it was a structural disruption, weakening nations' social cohesion and creating instability that would have far-reaching consequences. The generational trauma also extended to families and communities. Letters from soldiers, diaries, and posthumous accounts revealed the daily suffering endured at the front. Parents received telegrams confirming deaths or injuries, while siblings and friends were forced to confront the absence of those who had seemed invincible. Communities erected monuments and memorials to preserve the memory of those lost, attempting to fill the emotional void created by staggering casualties. The grief was collective and permanent, embedding a sense of mourning into the cultural fabric of entire nations. Schools, churches, and civic organizations struggled to educate and care for a population that had been deeply scarred by loss, grief, and disrupted family structures. Industrial warfare itself magnified the scale of the tragedy. The combination of machine guns, barbed wire, chemical weapons, and relentless artillery meant that even minor tactical miscalculations could result in catastrophic losses. A single misjudged attack, a poorly timed artillery barrage, or a miscommunication along the lines could wipe out battalions in minutes. Young men were sent into this environment with minimal preparation for the psychological and physical realities of modern combat. The cumulative effect was a systematic destruction of a generation, an entire cohort of young men subjected to industrialized death on a scale previously unseen in history. Education and professional development were also interrupted. Many young men who might have become doctors, teachers, engineers, or artists were instead consigned to a lifetime of trauma or killed outright. Universities and schools faced empty classrooms, apprenticeships went unfilled, and traditional pathways of social mobility were disrupted. The war robbed nations not only of lives but of potential, creativity, and leadership. This loss of human capital compounded the demographic and social consequences, leaving societies weakened and struggling to rebuild in the post-war years. The story of the lost generation is also a story of resilience and adaptation. Those who survived were forced to confront their own vulnerability and the fragility of life. Many struggled with physical disability, psychological trauma, and social alienation. Yet they rebuilt communities, contributed to cultural movements, and reshaped the world in their own way. However, the shadow of loss remained, influencing literature, art, and collective memory for decades. Memorials, books, and historical accounts preserved the memory of the young men who perished, ensuring that the tragedy of the lost generation would not be forgotten. World War I was not just a military conflict, it was a social and cultural catastrophe that permanently altered the course of European history. The lost generation represents the human face of this disaster, the young men who were killed, wounded, or irrevocably changed. Their absence affected families, communities, economies, and politics, leaving a void that reshaped the continent. The war stole a generation, and with it, the future that could have been. The human cost is staggering, the cultural loss immeasurable, and the emotional legacy enduring. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. For more deep dives into history's most shocking and consequential events, World War I was not just a physical battle. It was a psychological nightmare that permanently scarred an entire generation. Soldiers endured years of relentless bombardment, the thunder of artillery shaking the earth, and the constant whine of bullets overhead. Trenches, meant to protect them, became prisons filled with mud, vermin, and the stench of decay. These young men faced the daily reality that death could come at any moment. From a sniper's bullet, a shell exploding in the mud, or even from disease spreading uncontrollably in close quarters. The continuous exposure to such extreme stress was unlike anything previous generations had experienced. It created a new, invisible battlefield inside the minds of men, where fear, anxiety, and trauma fought alongside the physical dangers outside the trenches. The term shell shock emerged during the war to describe the effects of this relentless psychological pressure. Soldiers displayed symptoms of trembling paralysis, nightmares, and hysteria, often unable to function or follow orders. Commanders initially treated these cases as cowardice. Failing to recognize that the soldiers' minds had been pushed beyond natural limits, men who had survived artillery barrages and hand-to-hand combat sometimes collapsed under minor stress or refused to enter the front lines again. Hospitals became overcrowded with young men whose minds had been shattered by what they had witnessed and endured. It was a new type of casualty, one that could not be counted in bodies, but was equally devastating. The causes of shell shock were clear. Continuous exposure to high explosive artillery caused both physical and psychological damage. Soldiers lived under the constant roar of cannons, feeling the earth tremble beneath their feet and the shock waves rattle their bodies. Night after night, they listened to their comrades being killed, smelled burning flesh and gunpowder, and watched friends die in terrifying slow-motion ways. Disease and unsanitary conditions added to the stress, creating a relentless cycle of fear, exhaustion, and helplessness. Every day spent in the trenches compounded the mental strain, eroding resilience and leaving soldiers on the brink of collapse. The psychological trauma did not end when soldiers left the front. Returning home, veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. They faced the expectations of families and communities that could not comprehend the horrors they had endured. Men who had once been confident, ambitious, and hopeful found themselves haunted by memories that surfaced in nightmares, sudden flashbacks, or uncontrollable panic. Simple tasks, working, socializing, even sleeping could trigger the trauma anew. Many were institutionalized in asylums or military hospitals, treated with a mixture of fear and misunderstanding, while others were ignored entirely. Their mental wounds were invisible, yet they affected their behavior, relationships, and ability to function in society. The social impact of these psychological wounds was enormous. Communities lost a generation of young men capable of building families, businesses, and local leadership. Marriage rates declined in the post-war years as traumatized veterans were unable or unwilling to form traditional households. Parents mourned sons who returned physically alive but mentally shattered. Friendships and social networks were fractured by the shared yet isolated suffering of trauma. Even after the guns fell silent, the echoes of the war continued to reverberate through the minds of men who had survived. Affecting the culture and social fabric of entire nations, the cultural repercussions were significant. Writers, poets, and artists captured the raw psychological trauma of World War I, attempting to give voice to experiences that were otherwise unspoken. Works by Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Erich Maria Remarque revealed the horror of trench life, the constant mental strain, and the impossibility of returning to normalcy. Literature became a vessel for the collective pain of the lost generation, articulating experiences of fear, grief, and disillusionment that statistics could never convey. These cultural works highlighted that the war had not only killed millions, but had also left countless more alive, yet broken, challenging society to recognize and address the invisible wounds that lingered long after the fighting ended. The psychological devastation also affected military policy and treatment approaches. Initially, soldiers suffering from shell shock were stigmatized, often labeled cowards or shirkers, and punished. As the war progressed, some armies began to recognize the condition and implemented rest periods, counseling, and medical care. However, understanding was limited, and effective treatment remained scarce. Veterans often returned home, carrying the burden of trauma into families, workplaces, and social interactions, creating secondary stress for those around them. The war had created a generation in which mental illness was widespread, misunderstood, and inadequately addressed. Economic consequences compounded the psychological damage. Mentally scarred veterans were often unable to work consistently, limiting income for families and slowing post-war economic recovery. Communities had to contend with large populations of unemployed or underemployed men who had once been expected to be productive members of society. Public health systems, already strained by the war, struggled to provide care for the mentally injured. The loss of functional, healthy men added another layer to the societal devastation wrought by World War I, making the war's toll far deeper than the battlefield alone could illustrate. Families experienced long-term effects. Mothers, wives, and siblings were forced to adapt to men who returned emotionally distant, prone to anger, or consumed by invisible fears. Children grew up with fathers who could not engage fully, creating generational trauma. In some cases, the mental scars contributed to domestic breakdowns, alcoholism, or social withdrawal. Communities bore witness to a subtle yet profound unraveling of social cohesion, all stemming from psychological wounds inflicted by a war that had promised glory but delivered devastation. The lost generation's struggle with mental health was also emblematic of a broader societal failure. The scale of the conflict had overwhelmed traditional coping mechanisms and exposed the inadequacy of social, medical, and governmental structures to care for mentally injured soldiers. Governments were ill-prepared to address such widespread trauma, leaving many veterans to navigate a world that had moved on while their minds remained trapped in the battlefield. Public awareness of psychological suffering grew slowly, and it took decades before the long-term consequences of shell shock would be fully acknowledged and addressed. In sum, the psychological wounds of World War I created a generation living in the shadow of trauma. Shell shock, now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, was not limited to a few isolated cases. It was a structural problem affecting millions. Young men returned to their homes with shattered nerves, haunted memories, and an inability to reclaim the lives they had left behind. Their suffering reshaped families, communities, and nations, leaving a permanent mark on the social and cultural landscape of post-war Europe. The mental toll of the war compounded the physical and demographic losses, reinforcing the tragic narrative of the lost generation as one of both human and societal devastation. World War I was supposed to be a quick, decisive conflict fought for honor, duty, and national pride. Political leaders across Europe framed it as a noble enterprise, a defense of civilization against a rival power. Young men enlisted with enthusiasm, carrying letters of hope from families filled with promises of glory and heroism. Entire communities believed in the cause, expecting that a few months of fighting would result in a victorious return and the continuation of life as they knew it. This optimism was rooted in centuries of tradition, where wars were fought and settled quickly, and where the suffering of a few thousand could be absorbed by society. But the industrialized reality of World War I shattered these illusions. The war introduced technologies and tactics that were far removed from the battlefield heroics of the past. Machine guns mowed down charging infantry lines, artillery barrages obliterated trenches and morale, and poison gas created new forms of horror. Soldiers who had imagined a noble struggle found themselves trapped in mud-filled trenches, waiting hours or days for orders, often without food, clean water, or medical attention. Their expectations of glory collided violently with the relentless, impersonal mechanisms of modern warfare. The romantic ideals of courage and honor became meaningless in the face of mechanized death. The psychological impact of this disconnect between expectation and reality was profound. Young men who had joined with dreams of heroism found themselves disillusioned, watching friends and comrades die in meaningless, repetitive assaults. Officers, previously symbols of leadership and moral authority, often clung to outdated tactics that disregarded the lethal efficiency of modern weapons. Soldiers witnessed repeated failures in command, decisions that sent thousands to slaughter without tactical necessity, and a seeming indifference from political leaders far removed from the front lines. The ideal of noble sacrifice transformed into the grim reality of futile suffering, creating a collective cynicism that penetrated every layer of the generation. This disillusionment was not limited to the battlefield. Communities at home were exposed to the realities of war through casualty lists, letters, and newspapers. Families mourned sons, brothers, and husbands, their grief compounded by the awareness that these deaths were often preventable or strategically meaningless. Society's trust in its institutions, governments, military hierarchies, and even religious authorities eroded rapidly. People realized that the very structures that had promised protection and guidance had instead exposed millions to unnecessary death and suffering. The loss of faith in traditional authority became a hallmark of the lost generation. Art and literature became primary outlets for expressing this disillusionment. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Wilfred Owen captured the pervasive sense of futility and betrayal experienced by their peers. Hemingway's prose reflected the blunt reality of men attempting to navigate a world stripped of meaning, while Owen's poetry graphically depicted the horror and absurdity of trench warfare. This cultural movement emphasized the stark contrast between the idealistic narratives promoted by governments and the brutal truth witnessed by soldiers and civilians alike. The Lost Generation did not simply mourn the dead, they questioned the very purpose of the institutions and ideals that had led them to war. The philosophical implications were significant. Pre-war Europe had been steeped in ideas of progress, civilization, and moral authority. Leaders claimed that war could protect national honor and advance societal goals. The reality of industrialized slaughter demonstrated that progress in technology did not equate to progress in morality or wisdom. Millions of men were killed or maimed, while political elites negotiated behind closed doors, insulated from suffering. The disillusioned generation began to question the legitimacy of nationalism, the morality of political power, and the competence of societal institutions. These questions fueled existential and modernist thought in the decades that followed, influencing thinkers who sought to understand a world that had been betrayed by its own promises. The disillusionment also had social consequences. Many returning soldiers struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, finding that society had changed or failed to recognize their trauma. Veterans felt alienated, unable to reconnect with families or peers who had not experienced the front. They were faced with the task of rebuilding lives in a world that seemed indifferent to their suffering. This disconnect between soldiers and civilians deepened societal cynicism and reinforced the generational divide. For many, the war marked the first exposure to a world where human life seemed expendable, a lesson that would shape social attitudes for decades. Economic disruption further amplified the sense of disillusionment. European economies were strained by the war's costs, inflation soared, and infrastructure lay in ruins. Young men returning from the front found few opportunities for work, while governments struggled to provide pensions, healthcare, or meaningful support. The promises of a post-war boom and recovery were overshadowed by the harsh realities of economic instability, unemployment, and social unrest. Disillusionment was thus both psychological and practical, affecting personal futures and societal structures alike. Education and intellectual life also reflected this collapse of idealism. Universities and cultural institutions attempted to process the trauma through new curricula, literature, and social analysis. Students returning from the front questioned the traditional values and histories they had been taught. Art movements like Dadaist and Surrealism emerged as direct responses to the absurdity and destruction of war. Rejecting conventional forms, celebrating chaos, and exploring the psychological fragmentation of society. The Lost Generation's disillusionment was both deeply personal and widely cultural, reshaping European thought and creativity for decades. Religious faith, too, suffered under the weight of the war. Millions of men who had believed in divine justice or moral providence witnessed indiscriminate slaughter, disease, and suffering. Churches and religious authorities, unable to explain the scale of the catastrophe, lost credibility. Many veterans and civilians turned away from traditional faith, seeking alternative philosophies or adopting skepticism as a protective mechanism against despair. The war, as psychological and moral shock, created a vacuum where traditional structures of hope and guidance were inadequate. The loss of idealism was reinforced by the physical and symbolic scars of the war. Landscapes were transformed into devastated fields and bombed-out cities, providing constant, tangible reminders of destruction. Memorials and cemeteries dotted the countryside, each a testament to the human cost of national ambitions and strategic miscalculations. Survivors were confronted daily with evidence that human life was expendable in the pursuit of political and military goals, reinforcing cynicism and eroding faith in leadership. Finally, the disillusionment of the Lost Generation was generational in scope. Young men who had once been poised to inherit and shape Europe's future were physically and psychologically diminished. They returned with trauma, grief, and anger, influencing cultural and political life for decades. Their skepticism, cynicism, and disillusionment became defining characteristics of post-war society. Institutions, governments, and communities faced the challenge of integrating a generation whose faith in tradition, authority, and human progress had been fundamentally shaken. The war had shattered the belief that conflict could be noble, purposeful, or finite. Idealism was replaced by a grim realism shaped by personal experience, loss, and observation. Hope for a simple, just, and ordered world was replaced by the recognition that human institutions were fallible, often destructive and blind to suffering. This loss of innocence extended beyond those who fought. It rippled through families, cultures, and nations, ensuring that the impact of World War I would be felt long after the last shots were fired. The First World War devastated Europe, not only through loss of life, but also by crippling economies and dismantling social structures. Nations that had once prided themselves on industrial might found their factories destroyed, transport systems in shambles, and farmlands devastated by years of trench warfare. Roads, bridges, and railways, the arteries of commerce, were frequently shelled into rubble. Ports that had once facilitated global trade became unusable, and cities that served as industrial centers were reduced to ruins. Nations that had relied on continuous production to fuel both domestic consumption and export markets suddenly faced shortages, bottlenecks, and skyrocketing costs. In Germany, France, Britain, and Austria-Hungary, this physical destruction translated directly into economic collapse. At the same time, the financial burden of waging total war left governments with massive debts. To fund the war, countries had borrowed extensively from both domestic and international sources, often issuing bonds that promised enormous returns. Inflation rose steadily as governments printed more money to cover deficits, eroding the savings of ordinary citizens. In Germany, hyperinflation reached catastrophic levels in the early 1920s, wiping out the life savings of the middle class. People who had spent decades accumulating wealth suddenly found that their money could not buy basic foodstuffs or clothing. Families starved, while workers demanded higher wages, sparking strikes and civil unrest. The disruption of trade networks further compounded economic instability. Traditional supply chains had been interrupted for years, leaving industries unable to source raw materials. Steel, coal, and timber, essential for both civilian and military industries, were in short supply. Countries like Britain, which had relied heavily on imported resources, faced significant shortages that slowed reconstruction efforts. Factories that survived the war often lacked the materials or labor force needed to restart production, creating a cycle of stagnation and unemployment. Even countries less directly affected by physical destruction, such as Italy or Spain, felt the ripple effects through trade disruptions, refugee movements, and economic instability across Europe. Agriculture, the backbone of pre-war economies, also suffered catastrophic losses. Millions of hectares of farmland in France, Belgium, and Eastern Europe were turned into battlefields, left mined, or rendered infertile by shelling. Farmers were killed, displaced, or drafted, leaving fields unplowed and harvests short. The resulting food shortages drove up prices and created widespread hunger, further exacerbating social unrest. Urban populations dependent on food shipments from the countryside were particularly vulnerable. Starvation became a real and immediate threat, contributing to the perception that governments had failed to protect their citizens from the consequences of war. The combination of industrial ruin, debt, inflation, and food shortages destabilized social order. Governments struggled to provide basic services or maintain public confidence. In Germany, political extremism flourished as citizens searched for solutions to their suffering. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, was inundated with protests, strikes, and uprisings, including the infamous Spartacist revolt. In Italy, veterans returning from the front found that the sacrifices they had made had not been rewarded with employment, pensions, or recognition, fueling the rise of Mussolini and the fascist movement. Across Europe, the social contract was fraying. People had fought and suffered for their nations, only to find that their leaders had bankrupted the country, mismanaged reconstruction, and left ordinary citizens to pick up the pieces. The psychological impact of economic collapse was intertwined with the personal trauma of the lost generation. Men who survived the front lines returned to societies in chaos. Jobs were scarce, wages were insufficient, and inflation had destroyed the value of their earnings. Many veterans felt betrayed by governments that had sent them to die. only to return to a world of scarcity and instability. Without meaningful work, with families struggling to survive, and with political systems in disarray, these men carried both visible and invisible scars. Their disillusionment fueled a sense of alienation, making it difficult for them to trust institutions, participate in politics, or rebuild normal lives. Hyperinflation, debt, and economic collapse also eroded international confidence. Countries that had once lent or borrowed with predictability now faced defaults, currency devaluations, and trade collapses. Germany, obligated to pay reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, struggled to meet these payments amid hyperinflation, creating a vicious cycle of debt, economic stagnation, and political extremism. In France, the industrial heartlands lay in ruins. Slowing reconstruction and fueling debates over territorial defense and reparations, in Britain, industries struggled to transition from wartime to peacetime production, leaving millions unemployed and fueling labor unrest. Across the continent, economies that had once been interconnected were fractured, making recovery slow, uneven, and painful. Political chaos became inseparable from economic instability. Governments that had survived the war were weakened by public discontent and factionalism. Elections frequently produced fragmented legislatures incapable of decisive action. In Germany, the fragile Weimar Republic faced constant challenges from both left-wing and right-wing extremists, while inflation and food shortages created fertile ground for radical movements. Italy saw similar dynamics, with returning soldiers joining paramilitary groups or supporting fascist uprisings. Even in countries like Britain and France, social unrest was frequent, fueled by strikes, protests, and demonstrations demanding wage increases, better housing, and pensions for veterans. The economic failure of the post-war period thus directly contributed to political instability, radicalization, and the eventual rise of authoritarian regimes. The lost generation lived at the intersection of economic ruin and political chaos. Young men returned from the front physically wounded, psychologically scarred, and economically disadvantaged. Families who had lost sons or fathers faced both emotional and financial strain, struggling to survive in societies where public services were overwhelmed and jobs were scarce. Communities that had once been stable were now fractured by class tensions, competition for scarce resources, and widespread disillusionment. Social cohesion, which had been eroded by years of war, was further strained by economic collapse and political uncertainty. Culturally, the economic and political collapse reinforced themes of disillusionment, cynicism, and alienation. Writers, poets, and artists reflected the stark reality of post-war Europe, depicting not only the horrors of the battlefield, but also the crushing weight of financial ruin and governmental failure. Literature and art of the period often focused on the failure of leadership, the emptiness of nationalistic slogans, and the helplessness of ordinary people caught in events beyond their control. This cultural output solidified the perception that the world the lost generation had inherited was one of broken promises, moral ambiguity, and structural collapse. The economic devastation of World War I also had long-term geopolitical consequences. Countries weakened by debt, infrastructure loss, and social unrest were less able to defend their borders or project power internationally. This created a vacuum that allowed extremist ideologies to take root. In Germany, the economic collapse contributed directly to the conditions that enabled Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to rise. In Italy, the combination of post-war hardship and political dissatisfaction paved the way for Mussolini's fascist state. Even in more stable nations, the economic turmoil of the 1920s influenced policy decisions, including restrictive immigration laws, tariff wars, and cautious foreign interventions, as governments sought to manage domestic instability rather than engage abroad. The intertwining of economic ruin and political chaos demonstrates that the lost generation's suffering extended far beyond the trenches. Surviving the war was only the first challenge. Reintegrating into a shattered economy, a destabilized political landscape, and a society grappling with trauma proved equally deadly to the human spirit. The collapse of industry, agriculture, and financial stability created a pervasive sense of insecurity. While political fragmentation prevented coherent solutions, the generation that had survived industrialized slaughter now faced the equally destructive reality of social and economic disintegration. Ultimately, The post-war period in Europe illustrates how war can create cascading failures. Millions of lives were lost to bullets and shells, but millions more were affected indirectly by poverty, unemployment, and political instability. The economic and political aftermath of World War I did not merely punish individual nations, it reshaped the continent, ensuring that societies would be vulnerable to extremism, authoritarianism, and further conflict. The lost generation, therefore, not only suffered immediate physical and psychological losses, but also inherited a Europe whose economic and political foundations had been thoroughly undermined, limiting opportunity, safety, and stability for years to come. The final consequence of the lost generation was not just the physical death and psychological trauma of millions of young men, nor the immediate economic and political chaos left in the war's wake. It was the permanent scar the conflict left on global politics, setting the stage for instability, extremism, and another, even more catastrophic war. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 to end hostilities, failed to address the fundamental sources of resentment and instability that had been created by World War I. Rather than securing lasting peace, it institutionalized grievance and created fertile ground for extremism. Germany, the nation most severely punished by the treaty, bore the brunt of the war guilt clause, which forced it to accept full responsibility for starting the conflict. Beyond mere acknowledgement of responsibility, Germany was saddled with massive reparations, which drained national resources and destabilized an already fragile economy. The reparations were designed in theory to compensate the Allied powers for their losses, but in practice, they crippled Germany. Factories struggled to produce goods for domestic needs, while simultaneously attempting to generate export income to meet reparations payments. Inflation skyrocketed, wiping out savings and making basic necessities unaffordable. By 1923, the German mark had become virtually worthless. Ordinary citizens starved or lived in grinding poverty, and many began to view the Weimar Republic as an incompetent, weak, and illegitimate government. This widespread resentment and social unrest did more than harm the economy. It fed the rise of extremist political movements. Nationalistic groups exploited the humiliation imposed by Versailles, claiming that Germany had been betrayed both externally by foreign powers and internally by weak politicians and socialist elements. This rhetoric found an audience among veterans of the war, men who had survived industrialized slaughter only to return to a society that seemed incapable of honoring their sacrifice. Groups like the Nazi Party, which emerged from the rubble of post-war chaos, used these grievances to galvanize support, promising revenge, restoration of national pride, and the rebuilding of military power. In this way, the lost generation as suffering and the punitive measures of Versailles combined to produce political extremism with global consequences. The problem was not confined to Germany. Across Europe, the war had hollowed out the leadership class and eroded traditional authority. Russia had already experienced revolution in 1917, leading to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty and the creation of the Soviet Union. Austria-Hungary had dissolved into multiple independent nations, each struggling to establish legitimacy. The Ottoman Empire had disintegrated, leaving the Middle East carved up by colonial powers with little regard for ethnic, religious, or historical realities. In each case, the political vacuum created by war amplified grievances, empowered radicals, and destabilized governments. Countries that had survived militarily intact were nevertheless weakened socially and politically, struggling to manage populations traumatized by loss, famine, and dislocation. The economic repercussions of the lost generation further amplified political instability. Countries were burdened with debt, both domestic and international. Britain and France owed massive loans to the United States, which had entered the war later and suffered less direct destruction. The U.S., in turn, emerged as a global creditor, wielding unprecedented financial influence. The financial imbalance created tensions between nations as governments struggled to balance repayment obligations with domestic needs. In Germany, hyperinflation eroded trust in financial institutions and fueled resentment toward international creditors. In Italy and Spain, economic stagnation and unemployment empowered radical movements that promised strong leadership, national rejuvenation, and solutions to unemployment and poverty. Across the continent, the link between economic hardship and political extremism became undeniable. The social consequences of the lost generation also had long-term implications for politics. Entire generations of men had been killed or incapacitated, leaving demographic gaps that affected family structures, labor markets, and leadership pipelines. Communities struggled to replace the skilled workers, intellectuals, and leaders lost in the war. Women who had filled many roles during the conflict faced new pressures as men returned or failed to return from the front. Social norms and expectations shifted, sometimes violently, as populations tried to adjust to the new reality of fewer men and widespread grief. Political systems that depended on stable, educated, and engaged citizens found themselves grappling with populations traumatized both by the battlefield and by the chaos of post-war society. Culturally, the lost generation left a legacy of cynicism, disillusionment, and skepticism toward authority. Art, literature, and philosophy reflected the shattered ideals of the pre-war era. Writers such as Ernest Hemingway, Erich Maria Remarque, and Virginia Woolf documented the futility of war, the emptiness of patriotic rhetoric, and the alienation of young men who had survived only to find that society had failed them. This cultural output was not merely artistic, it influenced political attitudes, contributing to skepticism about governments and skepticism about the promises of national leaders. Populations increasingly questioned authority, social hierarchies, and traditional narratives of honor, sacrifice, and loyalty. The geopolitical consequences of the lost generation extended beyond Europe. Colonies that had contributed troops or resources were left to navigate post-war instability with little support. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, populations that had been mobilized or taxed to support the European war effort found themselves disillusioned and politically energized. The promises of greater autonomy or self-determination were often ignored, creating new tensions and revolutionary movements that would later erupt into decolonization struggles. The war had expanded its consequences globally, ensuring that the political fallout of the lost generation would be felt far beyond the European continent. Perhaps most importantly, the lost generation guaranteed that Europe would face another, even deadlier conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, rather than healing wounds, codified resentment. The social, economic, and political instability left nations vulnerable to the rise of militarism and fascism. Adolf Hitler's ascent in Germany, Mussolini's rule in Italy, and the militaristic expansion in Japan were all rooted, at least in part, in the chaos left by World War I. The lost generation had not only been physically decimated, its absence and suffering created conditions in which new generations were exposed to radical ideologies, nationalistic fervor, and the allure of authoritarian solutions to problems left unresolved by the war. The human cost of the lost generation was therefore intertwined with global politics. The men who died, the survivors who were broken physically and mentally, and the populations who endured famine, displacement, and social collapse all contributed to a world that was fragile, resentful, and prone to extremism. The inability to create a just and sustainable peace meant that Europe did not recover fully before another catastrophic war emerged. The lost generation's suffering became both a symbol and a mechanism of instability, illustrating how the failure to protect a generation can have profound consequences for the world. In sum, the lost generation represents more than just a demographic tragedy. It represents a permanent scar on global politics, a warning of how interconnected warfare, economics, social disruption, and political extremism can become. The generations that followed inherited a world that had been destabilized not just by the immediate consequences of battle, but by policies, treaties, and political miscalculations that failed to address the deep trauma and structural damage caused by industrialized war. The League of Nations, created to prevent future conflicts, was powerless in the face of these unresolved tensions. Nationalism, resentment, and economic hardship made the next global conflict almost inevitable. The long-term cost of World War I, therefore, is inseparable from the story of the lost generation. Their absence in society left demographic gaps, weakened institutions, and undermined social cohesion. Their suffering, combined with punitive peace measures and economic collapse, created fertile ground for political extremism. Governments that failed to provide security, stability, or opportunity contributed to the conditions that would allow fascist regimes to rise within 2 decades. The lost lives, broken bodies, and shattered spirits of this generation were not just personal tragedies. They were catalysts for political instability and international conflict that reshaped the 20th century. The legacy of the lost generation reminds us that war is not confined to the battlefield. The death and suffering of a single generation can ripple through politics, economies, and societies for decades. The Treaty of Versailles, economic turmoil, and political chaos all show that the consequences of war extend far beyond the signing of peace treaties. The lost generation, robbed of their youth, opportunity, and leadership, left a void that destabilized nations, inspired extremism, and set the stage for the global conflagration of World War II.